What if the fiercest battle in the Wild West wasn't fought against bandits or warriors, but against an invisible enemy that penetrated walls and turned homes into icy traps? Can you imagine a cabin where the walls are covered with frost, not on the outside, but on the inside? This was the harsh reality for northern pioneers, where frost was not just a visitor, but a permanent resident, threatening their very existence. Survival in such conditions required not just perseverance, but true ingenuity. Pioneers became engineers and inventors, developing unique methods of thermal insulation. They learned from nature, used the most unexpected materials, and created solutions that are still impressive in their effectiveness today. It was a quiet, daily war for every degree of heat. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how pioneers used ordinary mud, moss, and pine resin to create a sealant that surpasses modern equivalents. Why double walls were more important than thick ones, and how a simple dugout on a hillside could be more comfortable than a spacious log cabin. What I am about to describe shatters all our notions of home comfort. For us, a house is a fortress that protects us from the elements. But for the pioneers of the northern Wild West, home often became a place where the cold showed its true colors. We are talking about a phenomenon that was more frightening than the blizzard outside the window. Ice growing on the walls inside the hut. It wasn't just cold, it was the constant visible presence of frost in the living space. Imagine waking up in the morning not to sunlight, but to your hair frozen to the wall. Every breath, every puff of steam from cooking instantly settled on the log walls and turned into a thick crust of frost. This icy glaze grew day by day, making the walls not just cold to the touch, but turning them into an active source of cold that radiated into the room. The problem was one of physics, which the pioneers learned from their own experience. No matter how thick a log wall was, it still had low thermal resistance compared to modern materials. The warm, moist air inside the hut, from breathing and cooking, came into contact with the frozen wood and instantly condensed, then froze. A conventional fireplace or hearth was almost useless in such a situation. It created a small island of heat a few meters away from itself, but at the same time worked like a giant pump. To maintain combustion, the hearth drew huge volumes of icy air from outside into the hut through every crack, making the corners and walls even colder. A vicious circle arose. The more you heated, the stronger the drafts and the thicker the ice. This internal ice was not just an inconvenience, it was a direct threat. It made their already meager life unbearable, constantly reminding them of the fragility of their shelter. The whole atmosphere in the house became icy. Metal utensils burned their hands with cold, and any fabric left near the wall turned into a frozen lump by morning. The struggle against this phenomenon was constant. People were forced to scrape ice off the walls like they scrape ice off the sidewalk. This ice melted, turning into dirty water on the floor, which in turn increased humidity and led to even more icing the following night. It was exhausting and seemingly hopeless work. This phenomenon also destroyed the very structure of the house. Moisture penetrating the logs and freezing there expanded and eventually caused the wood to crack. The house literally began to devour itself from the inside under the influence of the cold. This forced the settlers to look for more radical solutions. They realized that they needed to fight not the ice, but the cause of its appearance. It was necessary not just to heat the air in the hut, but to create a barrier between the internal heat and the external cold. It was necessary to stop moisture from condensing on the walls. This was the first step towards understanding the need for real thermal insulation. This problem was unique to log buildings in harsh climates. Stone or brick houses had a different heat capacity, and dugouts, as we will see later, used a completely different principle. It was the log cabin, a symbol of the frontier, that proved to be the most vulnerable structure in the face of the Arctic cold, requiring incredible ingenuity from its owners. All these efforts were aimed at one thing: turning an icy trap into a livable space. They realized that the foundation of survival was not fire, but the ability to retain heat. This experience, paid for with discomfort and despair, formed the basis of the unique building techniques of the northern frontier. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about such a daily struggle with the laws of physics in your own home, when even your own breath turns against you? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next episodes on forgotten survival technologies. Want to know the secret that was more important than walls and a roof? When we imagine a pioneer's cabin, we think of walls and a roof. But the biggest mistake a settler could make had nothing to do with them. The main battle for warmth began even before the first log was cut. It began with the foundation, or rather the complete lack thereof. The first settlers, rushing to shelter from the weather before the onset of winter, often built their huts directly on the ground. At best, they slightly leveled the site. This meant that the floor in their first home was simply trampled earth. This approach was quick and cheap, but in winter it turned into a disaster. The ground beneath the hut, unprotected by a layer of snow, froze to a great depth. This cold, constant, and relentless rose straight into the living space. The earthen floor became not just cold, it became icy. It was like living on the surface of a giant iceberg that was impossible to heat. Even if the hearth inside the hut was desperately stoked, the air near the floor remained icy. Warm air rose and a heavy frosty layer accumulated at the feet. This made life in the hut unbearably uncomfortable and dangerous. Any spilled liquid instantly froze on the floor. It quickly became clear that it was necessary to separate the living space from the frozen ground. This led to the first improvement, a floor made of split logs or a puncheon floor. The logs were split in half and laid flat side up on small support logs lying directly on the ground. This was already better than bare earth. Wood has much lower thermal conductivity and does not draw cold as much. However, this design still had many drawbacks. The logs did not fit tightly together, and cold air with moisture still seeped in from below. The next logical step was to stop laying the logs on the ground. The pioneers began to build their huts on corner stones or short log posts. This created a small space under the floor, known as a crawl space. Beams were laid on top of these supports, and more even boards were laid on top of them, if they could be made. The creation of this air gap under the floor was revolutionary. It completely cut off the living space from the frozen ground. The floor was now wooden, and air circulated under it. This immediately made the hut much warmer and drier. However, this solution created a new problem. The air gap under the floor was open on all sides. The icy winter wind blew freely into this space, cooling the floor from below. The effect was comparable to sleeping on a bed with a fan constantly blowing underneath it. Therefore, the next step was to build a zyvalinka. The settlers learned to fill the space under the hut around the entire perimeter for the winter. They used earth, turf, straw, or any other materials available. This created a barrier that prevented the wind from penetrating under the floor and utilized the insulating properties of the earth itself, or the snow that accumulated on top of the embankment. This simple measure, raising the house above the ground and insulating the subfloor, was perhaps one of the most important steps in the fight for warmth. It solved the problem of cold coming from below once and for all. Only after that did it make sense to work on the walls and roof. This was only the first step in a long battle. What was the next line of defense? In the next chapter, we'll talk about how pioneers turned ordinary mud, moss, and pine resin into a high-tech sealant that was critical to survival. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the master carpenters of that time, which turned a wind-blown barn into a warm fortress. Even a perfectly constructed log cabin is not a monolithic wall. It consists of individual logs, and there are inevitably gaps between them. In the harsh northern climate, these gaps, no matter how narrow, became the main gateway for the cold. The wind found the slightest crack and penetrated inside, blowing out the heat and bringing in the icy cold. This process was so intense that on a windy day, the temperature in the hut could drop by tens of degrees in a matter of minutes. Therefore, sealing these joints, known as chinking and daubing, was not just a finishing job, but a matter of life and death. It was a complex two-step process that required special skill. The first stage, chinking, involved filling the large gaps between the logs. A variety of materials were used for this purpose, which could provide a flexible and durable base. These could be wood chips, pieces of wood, dried moss, or even tightly twisted bundles of grass. This material was not intended to be a sealant in itself. Its purpose was to create a solid foundation for the next layer and prevent it from collapsing inward or outward. The chinking was carefully packed into the gaps, trying to make it as tight as possible. The durability of the entire insulation depended on the quality of this work. The second stage, doughing, was the final sealing. This involved applying a viscous, plaster-like compound that covered the chinking and adhered to the logs, creating an airtight seam. The standard recipe for this compound was simple: clay, sand, water, and some reinforcing filler, such as chopped straw or grass. However, this simple mixture had a fatal flaw. The clay shrunk and cracked as it dried. Over time, under the influence of moisture and temperature changes, this sealant would crumble and fall off in pieces, opening the way for the wind. Every fall, the pioneers had to go over and repair all the seams, which was hard and dirty work. This is where the true ingenuity of the northern pioneers came into play. They began experimenting with the composition, adding components that would make it more elastic, water-resistant, and durable. One of these secret ingredients was pine resin. It was collected from trees, melted, and added to the clay mixture. The resin acted as a powerful natural polymer. It made the mixture viscous and sticky, providing incredible adhesion to wood. After drying, the resin prevented the clay from cracking, retaining some elasticity. Most importantly, it made the seam waterproof. Water could no longer wash away the sealant. In other regions, lime was added to the mixture, if it could be obtained, or ash. These components also improved the properties of the composition, making it more durable and long-lasting. Pioneers constantly experimented, creating their own unique recipes, which were passed down by word of mouth. The process of applying this improved composition was also an art. It had to be applied in the right weather, not too hot and not too rainy. The mixture was carefully rubbed into the seams, smoothing it with wet hands or a wooden spatula. The result was a strong, elastic, and airtight seam that could last for years. This seemingly primitive process was actually a high-tech solution for its time. It required a deep understanding of the properties of materials and strict adherence to the technology. It was this layer of sealant, not the thickness of the logs, that determined how warm the hut would be in winter. If you found this forgotten art of turning mud and resin into effective insulation interesting, please like this video. It will greatly help us in creating new episodes. What if I told you that not all log cabins are equally useful, and that the shape of the logs determined whether a family would survive the winter? In our minds, the classic pioneer log cabin is built from round logs. It looks authentic and romantic, but in terms of thermal efficiency, it was the worst possible solution. Pioneers in the North realized this very quickly. The problem with round logs is obvious as soon as you try to stack them on top of each other. They only touch each other at one narrow point along their entire length. This creates huge V-shaped gaps between them. These gaps had to be filled with a huge amount of chinking and doughing. As we already know from the previous chapter, this sealant was the weakest part of the wall. The more of it there was, the higher the likelihood of cracking, chipping, and drafts. Walls made of round logs required constant repair and maintenance. They were cold, drafty, and inefficient. Therefore, true master builders in the North quickly moved on to a completely different technology. They began to use hewn or squared logs. This meant that the log was given a flat shape by cutting 2 or even 4 sides off it. It was incredibly laborious work that required masterful axe skills. Special tools were used for this work, primarily a broad axe. The carpenter first made notches on the log and then ran along it, chipping away at the wood and creating a perfectly even, flat surface. This process transformed a round log into a massive rectangular beam. The advantages of this approach were enormous. When the hewn logs were laid in the wall, they fit together with their entire wide, flat surface. The gap between them was reduced to a minimum, sometimes only a few millimeters. This was a fundamental change in construction. Such a wall required significantly less sealant. The narrow seam was much easier and more reliable to fill. Often, moss chinking was not even necessary for this, and one doing was sufficient. The wall turned out to be almost monolithic, durable, and most importantly, incredibly warm. In addition, hewn logs solved another problem. The interior walls of the hut also became flat. This was a huge plus for everyday life. You could move a bed or table up against such a wall, or hang a shelf on it. In a hut made of round logs, this was practically impossible. Of course, building with hewn logs took much more time and effort. It was not something that could be built in a week, but the pioneers, who planned to settle in the north for a long time, understood that these investments would pay off handsomely in the very first winter. It was an investment in survival. The choice between round and hewn logs was a choice between speed and quality, between temporary shelter and a real home. In the harsh conditions of the northern frontier, this choice was often obvious. Those who were lazy or in a hurry risked not surviving the winter in their romantic round log cabins. But what if even perfectly fitted hewn logs were not enough to stop the Arctic cold? In the next chapter, we will see how the pioneers came up with an idea that we still actively use in modern construction today: the idea of a multi-layered wall. Even the best log wall had its limits. In conditions where temperatures remained extremely low for weeks on end, a solid log wall, no matter how thick, would freeze through. This was the very effect that led to the formation of ice on the inner surface. The pioneers realized that it was not enough to simply increase the thickness, but that the very principle of protection needed to be changed. This gave rise to the idea that forms the basis of modern frame construction: the idea of an air gap. The settlers empirically concluded that a layer of still air is one of the best insulators. The question was how to create this layer inside an existing or under construction hut. The solution was ingenious in its simplicity and became known as the double wall. It is important to understand that this did not mean building a second log wall next to the first. That would have been an irrational waste of materials and effort. The double wall was created from the inside. The process was as follows. After the log house was assembled and caulked, the pioneers began the interior work. They nailed vertical slats or bars to the inner, flat surface of the hewn logs. These bars created the necessary gap, or casing. A second inner layer of the wall was nailed on top of these slats. In the richest houses, this could be planed boards or clapboard. In simpler houses, any available sheet material was used. This could even be canvas soaked in lime or simply thick fabric stretched over a frame. As a result, an air gap several centimeters thick was formed between the cold log wall and the new interior finish. This layer of still air became a powerful thermal barrier. It prevented the cold from the outer wall from seeping inside and did not allow the heat from the room to escape outside. The effect of this improvement was immediate and very noticeable. The inner surface of the wall now had a temperature close to room temperature rather than street temperature. This completely solved the problem of condensation and internal icing. The walls became dry and warm. But the pioneers went even further. They quickly realized that this gap could be filled with some kind of insulation rather than left empty. This made the wall 10 times warmer. Anything that was at hand was used as insulation. The most common material was dry sawdust from the sawmill. They filled the space between the walls tightly with it. Sawdust was a light, affordable, and surprisingly effective insulator. They also used dry moss, straw, wood shavings, or any other dry and loose material. This technology was, in essence, the birth of the modern frame wall. The pioneers created a system consisting of an outer shell, log cabin, insulation, sawdust or moss, and interior finishing, boards. It was an incredibly advanced engineering solution for its time. Creating such a double wall required additional costs and time, but the result exceeded all expectations. The hut turned into a real thermos, capable of retaining heat in the most severe frosts with minimal fuel consumption. It was the final victory over the cold wall. Are you ready for the shocking truth about where all the heat that the pioneers fought so desperately to retain actually went? They could spend weeks building walls, carefully caulking the cracks, pouring pine resin over them, and covering them with clay to keep the wind out. They could install double doors and cover windows with thick curtains and shutters. But all these efforts were in vain if the main enemy was ignored. Not frost, not drafts, but physics itself. Warm air always rose, and in this pursuit, it knew no mercy. The roof was the largest and most insidious source of heat loss. All the heated air that rose from the hearth rose to the ceiling and found thousands of ways out, through cracks and poorly fitted boards. The pioneers could spend all day patching the walls, but if the roof was unstable, the heat would escape as if through a sieve. This was especially noticeable at night. It was still tolerable downstairs, but as soon as you climbed up to the ceiling, an icy wind reigned there. The very first roofs built by settlers were the weakest part of the house. They were made of dranki or shinga, chopped wooden planks laid overlapping like fish scales. This type of roof coped well with rain, diverting water, but was powerless against the cold. There were tiny gaps between the boards through which air could pass. Heat escaped outside, while cold seeped inside. At night, a quiet whistling sound could be heard above their heads. It was the wind seeping through the roof, filling the house with icy drafts. Sometimes snow would get inside, settling like fine dust on the shelves and beds. To reduce the losses at least a little, some settlers tried to coat the roof with clay or turf, but these measures were rarely long-lasting. In the spring, it all began to leak, crumble, and require reworking. In northern and flat regions, where good wood was scarce but grass was abundant, the pioneers found another, much more effective solution. They remembered an ancient technology, the sod roof. It was not just a craft, but a real art, combining the experience of the northern peoples and the ingenuity of the settlers. The sod roof not only retained heat, but also protected the house from wind, hail, and summer heat. Its design was simple but ingenious. The base was made of poles or boards, which served as a support. A waterproofing layer was laid on top of it. Anything that could retain water was used for this purpose. Birch bark, if there was a birch forest nearby, dried animal skins, thick fabric, or even dried moss. Without this layer, the roof would start to leak at the first downpour. Next came the most important component, the turf itself. It was cut in the meadow with sharp shovels, cutting out long strips with roots and clods of earth. These layers were carried to the roof and laid in two layers, the lower one with the roots down to create a base, and the upper one with the roots up so that the plants would not continue to grow. The thickness of the resulting covering could reach 30 and sometimes even 40 centimeters. Such a roof weighed several tons. Therefore, the walls and rafters had to be extremely strong. Otherwise, the structure simply would not have withstood the pressure. But the reward for the labor was an amazing result. The layer of soil and roots created a dense barrier that neither wind nor cold could penetrate. In winter, the heat rising from the hearth was trapped under the ceiling, as if under a cap. And in summer, such a roof kept the cool, saving from the heat. Another advantage was that the turf absorbed sound very well. Even during heavy rain or hail, it was quiet inside, as if the hut were underground. This gave the house a feeling of comfort and security. People said that sleeping under the turf is like sleeping underground, peaceful and warm. The process of building such a roof required enormous effort and skill. Each layer of turf had to be cut evenly so that it would fit without gaps. A mistake at this stage meant a leak. After installation, the roof required maintenance. It was sometimes trimmed, soil was added, and grass was planted so that the roots would intertwine and strengthen the covering. Over time, such a roof literally came to life. Flowers, grass, and even small bushes grew on it. However, it also had its drawbacks. The weight remained enormous, and the slightest error in calculation could lead to collapse. In the spring, when the snow melted, the soil absorbed moisture and became even heavier. Therefore, the pioneers reinforced the supports, installed internal posts under the ridge, and made sure that the beams did not sag. However, these difficulties were considered insignificant compared to the warmth provided by the turf roof. In areas where there was no turf, such as in the south or in dense forests, other methods were used. The most common was the construction of an attic floor. Boards were laid between the ceiling beams, and the space above them was filled with sawdust, hay, or dry leaves. This layer acted as thermal insulation. It was called a thermal cap. The sawdust had to be completely dry, otherwise it would start to rot or, worse, smolder. Therefore, it was often mixed with ash to repel mice and make the material less combustible. Sometimes a little sand was added to compact the layer more tightly. In winter, this layer retained precious heat, and in summer, it protected against the heat. The idea itself was ingenious in its simplicity. If you can't stop the air, you can slow it down. The air in the pores of the sawdust and turf became a trap for heat. In a house with such a roof, even in severe frost, it was possible to maintain a temperature at which the water in the hearth did not freeze. But there was a price to pay. When the house became almost airtight, the air quality inside deteriorated sharply. Smoke from the hearth, vapors, carbon dioxide, all of this remained under the roof. In winter, windows were not open to prevent heat from escaping, and people often suffered from suffocation and soot. Thus, the victory over the cold turned into a new threat, a lack of oxygen and the risk of fire. These solutions, whether it was a heavy but warm turf roof or an attic neatly covered with sawdust, became a decisive step in the fight for warmth. They literally sealed the hut from above, preventing precious calories from escaping into the sky. But the ideal thermal insulation solution brought new problems. Fire and smoke trapped within four walls became far more dangerous than the cold. What problem did they create, and why could the hearth, a symbol of comfort, become a deadly trap? We will talk about this in the next chapter, and you will learn about the main paradox of the pioneer's hut, where the fire that gave life could take it away in an instant. The heart of any pioneer's hut was the fire. It provided warmth, light, and the ability to cook food. However, as we have already mentioned, the classic open hearth or fireplace was not only a friend, but also an insidious enemy in the struggle for warmth. This was the main paradox of survival. What was supposed to provide warmth actually sucked the heat out of the house at an incredible rate. The problem lay in the very design of the open hearth. A fire requires a huge amount of oxygen to burn. It took this oxygen not from the street, but directly from the room. To compensate for this volume, the hut began to work like a vacuum cleaner, sucking in the icy outside air through every crack that the pioneers had so diligently sealed. An absurd situation arose. The fire was hot, but a few feet away an icy draft blew down your back. The more you stoked the fire to keep warm, the stronger the drafts became. The efficiency of such heating was depressingly low. According to various estimates, up to 90% of the heat from an open fireplace simply escaped up the chimney. The chimney, or flue, was a separate problem. In early huts, it was often made of wood coated with a thick layer of clay mixed with resin. This was extremely fire hazardous. The slightest crack in the clay and the hot gases could set the wooden frame on fire. Many huts were lost precisely because of such chimneys. The pioneers quickly realized that an open hearth was a luxury they could not afford in the northern climate. They needed a system that, first, would not steal warm air from the room, and second, would give maximum heat to the interior of the room, not to the street. The solution to this problem revolutionized frontier life. That solution was the cast iron stove. The advent of compact, mass-produced cast iron stoves, such as the Franklin, changed everything. These stoves could be transported in a wagon and were 100 times more efficient than any fireplace. The secret was in the closed firebox. The stove took in much less air for combustion, and this process could be precisely regulated with a damper. This immediately reduced drafts to a minimum. The cabin was no longer drafty. The most important thing was the efficiency of heat transfer. The entire hot metal surface of the stove acted as a radiator, emitting heat in all directions, not just forward like a fireplace. The heat remained in the room. The long metal chimney pipe passing through the room also gave off a significant amount of heat before the smoke escaped outside. The efficiency of such a stove was many times higher. It consumed much less wood, which was critically important in steppe or mountainous areas where fuel was scarce. One armful of wood in a cast iron stove provided as much heat as 3 armfuls in an open hearth. The transition from an open hearth to a closed cast iron stove was as important a step as the transition from an earthen floor to a wooden one. It allowed people not just to survive, but to live comfortably in their huts. Heat could now be controlled. It became uniform, stable, and efficient. Even after the floor, walls, and roof were insulated and an efficient cast iron stove was installed, the battle for warmth was not over. It simply moved to a new level, the microclimate inside the house. Now the task was not just to keep the heat in the hut, but to distribute it properly and protect against the slightest residual drafts. In this internal war, the pioneers' main weapons were textiles and the correct placement of furniture. Every rug, every curtain, every piece of furniture had not only an aesthetic, but also an important utilitarian function. It was the last line of defense against the cold. Even when insulated from below, the floor remained the coldest part of the room. Drafts from the front door inevitably flowed across the floor. Therefore, floors were never left bare. They were covered with anything that could provide an extra layer of insulation. These were homemade woven or rag rugs that women made from any scraps of fabric. In wealthier homes, tanned hides could be used. These floor coverings not only made walking on the floor more pleasant, but also physically blocked the movement of cold air, causing it to get stuck in the pile and fibers. The walls, even double ones, still radiated some cold. To combat this, they were draped. Blankets, homespun cloth, or any large pieces of fabric were hung on the walls. This created another third air gap that cut off the cold radiation from the wall. Windows were the biggest problem. In the 19th century, glass was expensive, thin, and had zero thermal insulation. A window was simply a hole in the wall covered with a transparent material. At night, it became the main source of cold. Therefore, at night, windows were always closed with massive internal wooden shutters. Heavy, thick curtains were hung over the shutters. Often these were simply old blankets. Their purpose was to fit tightly against the wall around the window, creating an airtight pocket and preventing the icy air from flowing from the windowsill to the floor. The arrangement of furniture was also subject to the logic of war against drafts. Beds were never placed close to exterior walls. They were moved to the center of the room, closer to the source of heat, the stove. This created a buffer zone and ensured that the sleeper would not come into contact with the icy wall. The most ingenious invention in this area was the canopy bed, or four-poster bed. We are used to thinking of it as a luxury item, but on the frontier it was a device for survival. 4 posts and a frame under the ceiling served to hang thick curtains on all sides. At night, these curtains were drawn, and the bed turned into a room within a room. This small enclosed space, warmed by the heat of sleeping people, was many degrees warmer than the rest of the hut. This allowed for relatively comfortable sleep, even if the water in the bucket by the door froze in the morning. Thus, the interior of the pioneer's hut was not just a collection of things, but a well-thought-out, multi-level system of thermal protection. Each element was in its place and worked toward a common goal: preserving precious heat.
It's good to be inside.
Aye, the fire keeps the cold away.
While some pioneers perfected their log cabins, bringing them up to thermos level, others took a completely different path. They did not try to build a fortress to withstand the cold. Instead, they decided to use the most powerful ally they could find on the frontier: the planet Earth itself. This philosophy led to the creation of 2 of the most unusual but incredibly effective types of dwellings in the Wild West: dugouts and sod houses. These structures were especially popular on the Great Plains, where there was no wood for log cabins, but there was an abundance of earth and wind. The Earth has a unique property: geothermal stability. At a depth of just a couple of meters, the soil temperature remains almost constant throughout the year, staying around 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. It doesn't matter if there is a blizzard outside with a temperature of 30 or an exhausting heat from 40. Underground, it is always the same. A dugout was the simplest and quickest way to take advantage of this. Pioneers would find a suitable hill or ravine slope, and simply dig a room into it. The interior walls and floor were made of compacted earth. The only part that needed to be built was the front wall with a door and window. The roof was also earth. Branches and grass were laid on beams placed over the dugout space, and a thick layer of turf was laid on top. The result was a dwelling that was almost completely integrated into the landscape. The thermal characteristics of such a house were phenomenal. It was not afraid of any frost or wind. The massive thickness of the earth on all sides served as an ideal heat accumulator. A small stove was enough to maintain a comfortable temperature, and this heat did not escape anywhere. Where there were no convenient slopes, sod houses were built. Sod was a unique building material. It was cut in the meadow with a special plow in the form of long strips, which were then chopped into bricks. These bricks, with their dense intertwining roots, were surprisingly strong. The walls were laid out with these sod bricks, as with ordinary ones, tying the joints. The thickness of such a wall could reach a meter. The roof was made in the same way as in a dugout, from beams covered with sod. The result was a house built entirely from the earth. Like a dugout, a soddy was incredibly warm in winter and cool in summer. The thick walls did not freeze through and did not let the wind in. Of course, such houses had their drawbacks. They were dark, often damp, and soil sometimes fell from the ceiling. But from the point of view of survival in an extreme climate, it was the ideal solution. Some settlers who already had log cabins but envied the warmth of dugouts used a hybrid approach. They embanked their houses. That is, they simply piled earth against the outer walls of the log cabin, sometimes up to the roof. This created a thick layer of earthen insulation that dramatically reduced heat loss. These earth technologies were the pinnacle of adaptation to the environment. They demonstrate that the pioneers not only fought against nature, but also learned from it, using its own laws for their own survival. Victory over the cold was not only achieved through global solutions such as double walls or earthen roofs. It consisted of dozens of small daily rituals, habits, and tricks. It was these seemingly insignificant details that constituted the last and most important line of defense. One of the most ingenious tricks was to use the enemy itself as an ally. We are talking about snow. The pioneers quickly noticed that deep snow was not only a problem, but also a fantastic insulator. A layer of loose snow contains a huge amount of air, working no worse than modern materials. Therefore, as soon as the first heavy snow fell, the settlers did not rush to clear it away. On the contrary, they deliberately shoveled it against the walls of the hut, creating a high snowdrift around the entire perimeter. This snowdrift, like a down blanket, covered the foundation and the lower part of the walls, completely blocking drafts and utilizing the heat of the earth. Another important improvement that came with time was the construction of a vestibule, or a porch. The pioneers realized that every time the front door was open, a hurricane of icy air rushed into the house, negating all their efforts to heat it. The solution was a simple extension in front of the entrance. It was a small, unheated room with two doors, one to the street and the other to the house. To enter, you first had to go into the vestibule, close the street door behind you, and only then open the door to the warm room. This simple airlock saved a tremendous amount of heat. Inside the hut itself, life was also full of little life hacks. To sleep warmer, they used more than just heavy blankets. Before going to bed, large flat stones or bricks were heated in the stove or fireplace. Then they were wrapped in thick cloth and placed in bed. This hot water bottle could give off heat for hours, warming the bed until morning. Humidity control was an art in itself. The pioneers understood that dry air is easier to heat and does not cause ice to form on the walls. Therefore, they tried not to dry wet clothes inside the hut and tried to cook meals that produced a lot of steam as quickly as possible. Even such a simple activity as gathering firewood was subject to strict rules. Firewood was never burned when wet. It was gathered a year in advance, split, and stacked in a woodpile so that it could season properly. Dry firewood produced much more heat and less smoke, which increased the efficiency of the stove. Sometimes in the most severe frosts, when nothing else helped, the pioneers resorted to extreme measures. They could build an inner tent, stretch blankets over the bed, creating a tiny space that could be warmed by breath alone. Life on the northern frontier was permeated by this constant, minute-by-minute attention to warmth. It was not just engineering, it was a culture of survival, consisting of thousands of little things, where every member of the family knew their role. And it was this culture, not just the thickness of the logs, that allowed them to greet the dawn after a long polar night. We have seen that the survival of the pioneers in the northern Wild West was a real war. A war not against people, but against physics itself. Their enemy was the merciless cold, and their battlefield was their own homes. And in this war, they proved themselves not only to be resilient, but also incredibly resourceful fighters. This story teaches us that in the harshest conditions, human ingenuity can find extraordinary and elegant solutions. The pioneers of the northern frontier did not just survive in the icy hell. They learned to live in it, creating warmth and comfort out of literally nothing. Which of these forgotten technologies do you think could be useful to us today, in an era of energy crises? Or perhaps you would like us to talk about other aspects of survival on the frontier, such as food production or water conservation in the desert? Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new, exciting stories about the conquest of the Wild West.